about, I'm trying to think of an example now, but I was it's not outside of Leeds somewhere, and I was doing it. I'm clearly not acting as a councillor, but if you're at a public consultation about a tram system that we are eventually going to have a view on, you're obviously there with a capacity as a councillor, and without going into the details, I guess it's really difficult to have an arbitrary view either way. And my question was going to be actually, who is the decision maker there on whether you are acting in capacity or not? Is it the monitoring officer, or does this board eventually have a...
Just very quickly to come to that point, and ultimately this board would, but initially advice will be provided by the monitoring officer or my deputies. If I could just come back on that and just make a very quick point, and then apologies, I do need to disappear. I think the point you're making is in relation, or that's been made, is in relation to how the law stands at the moment, and therefore it's a political decision as to whether that legal position is changed or not. But the legal position, the case law is very clear that there is a right to be present somewhere in a private capacity at the moment. So you may or may not agree or disagree with that position, but that is the legal position at the moment. And with that, apologies, I need to go.
Rick, you want to say something?
Thanks, Chair. Just for clarity, I mean, I live in a ward that I don't represent, and occasionally I go to things or am asked things in that ward. So I always preface it, this is not my ward, so this is my personal opinion. Yeah. I wouldn't be in a position such as you wouldn't find me drunk at 2 o'clock in the morning, so that wouldn't apply. But if I'm attending in a personal capacity outside of my ward, I always specify that, and I take it that is absolutely fine to do so. Whereas if it's in my ward, whether I'm there as personal or not, because I represent that ward, I would always be a councillor in that ward, no matter what, in my own head, because that's what the people expect of me that elected me. Is that acceptable?
Yeah, I understand that. But go on, Andrew.
Chair, thank you. I was intrigued by what the Chief Solicitor said there. If it's ultimately our decision as the board, I would move that we got further details of the board and made a decision about whether the context of this in the light of the law is appropriate. I generally don't know who this is or what the case is about, but other than what's written in the papers, but it does feel like this is something that we should be taking seriously.
Any further comments? Yes.
Just to clarify, at the moment, our complaints procedure for stage 1, the decision maker is the monitoring officer or her deputies in consultation with the independent person. It only becomes a board decision or a committee decision if it goes through further stages, and that comes from being able to sift out and deal quite quickly with the number of complaints we get. Otherwise we would have to have committee meetings more often, and I would say it's worked and it works successfully, especially with the liaison with the independent person as well. If someone isn't happy with that response, then they can write to the local government and social care ombudsman. So there is an element of not appeal to the council, but there is an element of further independent assessment if required.
Any further comment? Yes.
Thank you. Yeah, just wondering if it may be something that we want to include as part of the consultation response. Obviously, there's limitations at the moment to what we are able to do or dictate, but perhaps that's part of our recommendations where we're finding issues with the code as it exists.
Okay. Yes.
Just one comment, Chair. I've said this before, and I will say it again, that for a body the size of Leeds, for the number of complaints received during the year, it's absolutely incredible that there are so few. And I think that's all credit to the professional way in which people carry out their duties.
I agree. You remember when I first sat on this committee, we used to meet regularly, and there was a lot of political bias and a case that used to last forever, and so all that's gone, and I think it's dealt with much more sensibly, and I think we have full confidence in our officers in carrying that out. Any other comments on this section? Right. Well, we've been asked to receive and consider the matters, which we've done, so that's item 8. Item number 7 is the huge amount of work by our officers, and thank you for Andy and his team for putting all this together and dealing with it. Would you like to lead on that?
Thank you, Chair. Just very briefly by way of introduction, because I'm assuming members have probably got some comments. So just prior to Christmas, the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government launched a consultation which is set out on pages 13 to 41 of your agenda pack. The areas being consulted on are summarised at Appendix 3 on page 9, and the proposed Leeds City Council response is set out at Appendix B between pages 43 and 66. Appendix B also summarises the current Leeds City Council position in respect of the code arrangements, sets out in summary form the responses from groups, and also informed by those responses what that response from this committee might be. The deadline for the consultation responses to be received by the department is today, hence as meeting as late as possible to allow as much input from political groups. Thank you, Chair.
So we go to comments on our response, the draft standards. Who would like to comment? Andrew?
Thanks, Chair. I've got 3 comments, I think. So the first one is just the repetition of what I said previously. I won't labour the point, but I think we should put a general comment around when we're in public life and when we as elected members are in private life, and having a bit more clarity on that. So the situation in item 8 might be different in the future, and the public's perception of that. And then in terms of the questions, so I think the first one so question 12, should investigations come into the conduct of members who stand down before the decision of the conclusion is and the findings be published? So I feel like I know each group has given some comments, and so I'm aware of that. I think putting a no in there is a dangerous precedent, because if you are saying you can just avoid justice by resigning, I think that's a poor way forward. So I would like to put on record that I think question 12 should be a yes. The process should be continued, and I think this is particularly relevant where you can come back as an elected councillor. So, for example, if someone made allegation, if I did something that was outrageous and I stood down and then re-stood in 2027 again, I've basically ducked it. And so I think the logic of this saying if you stand down before they're published, it just goes away, is a really short-sighted and daft proposal. So I strongly suggest that we change that to yes, and ask the chair rights to the groups that have written no, including my own group, and say, can you think about changing it? And then my third comment is item 18. Do you think local authorities should be given the power to suspend elected members for serious code breaches? And again, I think there's real concern that I think the answer should be no, except for where there's current already permission, so where there's proven criminal position. I think it's really dangerous to put a yes in that column because of the dangers you talked about earlier about making it a political process. Ultimately, I think it goes back to, should the council be able to disqualify someone from standing? Again, I think the answer is no, because we've got to trust the public to make a decision. And if we're saying these are decisions that should be looked at and the results published, therefore then the public should be able to look at that and make their informed decision, not based on what we feel as a body or what a specific non-elected official thinks as an individual. So I think it's really dangerous when we as we as a system start saying to the electorate who should and shouldn't be able to be voted for. Clearly, I have strong political views on who you should and shouldn't vote for, but that doesn't mean I should limit the choices of the public. Thank you, Chair.
I think I'll go through my order. I had 4 points to raise, but just in response to Councillor Scopes' point, like I said, we get on well, so it's not meant to be personal. I'm not sure your points on question 12 and 18 follow one another. I think there is a bit of a contradiction in terms of how you would deal with it. On point 12, my approach to this and the approach of my group has been effectively these are HR matters, effectively, because if elected members commit a criminal offence, there is provision within the law about disqualification, etc. So what we're really talking about are the issues that in a normal world of employment, certainly for officers of the council, it would be matters that will be dealt with through HR as conduct or misconduct. And one of the fears that I have and my group have is the othering of elected members risks putting off people serving in public office. If we have a different set of guidelines and rules for elected members than we would for any other, in terms of natural justice, for any other employer, then why would professionals want to serve in elected office with those risks? And I mention that just because the term you used, Councillor Scopes, was escaping justice. But if it's a criminal matter, the courts would deal with that. In normal life, there is things like non-disclosure agreements are in use when people leave or they move jobs and positions. You can manage out a problem or a person elsewhere, which is probably quite live for us at the moment. But for councillors, there's a reputational issue where in public life, there's I mentioned the sniff test earlier, that something gets in the press and that's reputational. You might be innocent, but you then have to go back to your electorate with all of that in the news, despite the fact you might be innocent. So I think we have to bear that in mind. And with that, I just want to make its questions really, Chair. On question 3, one of the suggestion is that I think it comes out of the Labour Group's response that we adopt the LGA code, but also reflect local circumstances. I just wanted to be clear what those local circumstances are that we currently go above and beyond. Is there an answer to that one?
We have, through you, Chair, we have slightly refined arrangements around declaration of other registrable interests. So, for example, if you are elected by the council to an outside body by the council, then you can continue to be representative, if you like, in terms of voting and discussing matters on such an outside body. Whereas if you're not, then there's additional tests that members have to take in terms of the public interest.
Okay, I'm very content with that. On question 8, this in no way brings into question the professionalism of our independent persons, but the point I made was to whom are they accountable? So if we give voting rights to independent people, we are accountable by the ballot box. We are appointing the independent people, but there is a question around that, and effectively to whom are they accountable?
Again, through you, Chair, I do have a difficulty with the MHCLG consultation question on this, because in my professional view, they're conflating the role of an independent person as currently prescribed in legislation with something different as being a member of a committee, and even in some of the discussions I've heard, potentially chairing committees and, as you say, having voting rights. So in my discussions with MHCLG, I have made that point that they need to be a lot clearer about the role of an independent person supporting members through the complaints process and providing an objective view to the monitoring officer and myself and Nicole when assessing complaints, and the very different role of an independent member of a committee that's sitting and hearing cases. I think they are very different and distinct. That's my professional view.
I think it's just being aware of then the impact that has elsewhere on our procedural rules around co-opted members on scrutiny boards and voting rights, and I think further on in the paper we discussed whether political balance is appropriate as well. If we were to take the view that it is, then until Councillor Holroyd Case walked in a moment ago, we opposition members had the majority already on this panel this morning. If now you add in the voting members of the independent ones, we still hold a majority. So effectively, this morning, we could do something that the administration don't want to do, and that might conflict with if we're going to go on a political balance route. So keep that in mind. I think my final 2 questions, Chair, if I can. Question 18. It's just a bit about it being a neutral act, a suspension being a neutral act, and I made this point earlier. It's never a neutral act because it leaks, and then we're answerable to the press in a way that officers aren't. And if we are all very mindful at the moment not to comment at all on external investigations going on where police are involved, but we don't have that privilege as elected members, and I just think we need to be aware that we might say something should be a neutral act, but there's realpolitik in this as well, and that's not to protect elected members, it's actually to encourage the public to become elected members in the future. We need to be aware of that. And my final question, Chair, on question 19, I've highlighted the bit in the response that says the bit that says it's rare. So I get this. Representative democracy is the foundation of local government. The suspension of a member fairly elected via constituency should be rare and reserved for only the most serious failings. I presume that's not the criminal ones. So can we give some examples of what you would consider to be to warrant suspension that isn't a matter already covered from the disqualification rules around criminality?
It's interesting. In terms of the rules around criminality, they're often outside of the requirements or the business of an elected member. So bankruptcy and those sorts of things, or a criminal conviction that has is it a 3-month custodial sentence associated with it, suspended or not. So I think very often those circumstances arise outside of the normal business of being a member. It's interesting, to me at least, what the government are going to do in respect of disclosable pecuniary interests, and whether they're going to maintain the links through to the police to investigate those matters. I think there's a view in some of the local government community that that's part of the system that doesn't work particularly well, and there's very limited resources for the police in those circumstances to actually have an interest. So I would potentially see, depending on what government do with DPIs, that something that is found in respect of a member failing to comply with pecuniary interests might well fall within a potential area of a rare circumstance. Other than that, as Gordon mentioned, we've got so few cases in Leeds. It's difficult to pull up some examples that we think might have warranted a suspension. They're all routinely very well behaved.
Any further comments? Yes.
Thank
Claire.
you. Thank you, Chair. Just to say, I support the response as drafted with regards to the independent member role in terms of your response, and then just to note that I've responded separately as an individual just to the consultation and made Andy aware. Thank you.
Anything else? Could I just be clear, just in terms of the response, I will strengthen up the bit that we've discussed. I'll try and reflect some wording in respect of the public life element that the government really needs to be a lot clearer on that. So I'll add some additional wording into that. Is there any other word changes that members would wish to see in respect of any of the questions?
Andrew?
I think I've already made my point about
Yeah, I think you
word
have.
changes, but I recognise that the three groups have all, particularly in item 12, have said something different to myself. But as long as it's minuted in this meeting, I think that's okay. Thank you.
Yes, Rick.
Just a quick point on what Councillor Scope said about whether or not an investigation ends if a term of office ends, and then you could come back later. Yeah, you could resign, and then you could come back a year later because the investigation's been sort of terminated. Would there not be a potential for, if you come back, that then is reopened because it wasn't investigated at the time because you were no longer a councillor? And I understand the rationale behind that due to resources, but I just wondered if that was something that might help.
Joanne, yes. Did you say? Yes. Sorry.
Yeah, just wondering whether we could add that to the response. So, is that something that would be something we could put in as an additional that says that if that's happened, we have some kind of protection?
I think evidentially it's quite difficult from a pragmatic point of view. If you've got a 2 or 3 year hiatus between a member stepping down and then seeking re-election, actually to reopen a case, I think would be really potentially quite difficult.
We have had cases in the past where people have stood down and then come back, and it's not being picked up either by the local authority or by the police. So that has happened. So it could happen. Yeah. Sorry.
Again, I think we need to be mindful that, I mean, obviously the macro level best example of this is what's just happened in the United States. The electorate is pivotal to this, and if they return somebody, it's their wish, then it is the duty of the officers of this council to respect that, and that's that, really. I think what we're missing, and it's not a role that we can respond to here, is there's a party political structure as well, isn't there? So if you think of recent examples here, where we might have had members who have been suspended from their political party but couldn't be suspended from council, but they were never going to come back because the political party has dealt with it. So we have to respect that there is that element in the representative democracy we work in, that there's a role for the political parties to deal with that individually. And I think I would very much push back against any suggestion that somebody who resigns before a process is completed is assumed guilty when they come back, or anything continues because a process has not been seen through and they have left, and that under whatever circumstances there was not a result. And I think we can only look at things, I would say, and I think officers would back me up here, that we can only investigate things as standards issues in something that happened while somebody was a serving member in the first instance. And we do have to take into account that if they've left and come back, that is with the will of the of the voters.
Yes, Councillor Dye.
Yeah, I can see the difficulty in that, and it does make sense. I just wanted to clarify that I wasn't making the point that we should assume somebody was guilty if they came back. My question was, should we reopen the process, which probably, on reflection, isn't such a good idea, but it's a different point.
Okay, any further comments? Yes, Gordon.
Yeah, just to say, Chairman, to come back on the independent person role again, like my colleague, I've also responded directly to it as an independent person, and I think it would need very, very careful handling. I respect the comments that are down from the groups, but I think it would need very careful handling if the independent person was to be given voting rights.
Yes, I agree. And it's also very important that the council does appoint an independent council who is worthy of that position. I think we're very fortunate having Gordon, who was a senior magistrate, member of the Lord Chancellor's committee. So thank him for all his work that he does on our behalf. Any further comments? Anything else?
I think just
Okay.
the recommendations.
Recommendations, where's that? So just going to the recommendations, members are consider and agree the draft response set out in Appendix 2. Do we agree that? Do we accept that?
No, I disagree.
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll put that in the minute, Chair.
Sorry.
We'll include that in the minute.
Yes, we will include that. That is noted and recorded. Any other further comments? Okay, that's accepted then. Item number 9. Fine.
Don't introduce it.
And all the papers. The purpose of this report is to present to the committee a draft of the annual report of the Standards and Conduct Committee. We're asked to consider and approve the draft annual report and to note that the Chair will present the annual report to full council, which will be very short. Any comments? Any?
Chair, just by way of additional comments, the report is very similar in format to those that you've taken previously. It provides a high-level summary, drawing information from the monitoring officer's report that you considered earlier, and it will be considered at the March full council meeting. Thank you, Chair.
Do I take it that all members of council receive this report online?
They will as part of their agenda pack, Chair, for the council.
Because obviously the paperwork for this meeting is 91 pages. I just, you're not expecting the Chair to read that out.
A minor point at risk of drafting these things by committee, but given the conversation we had on page 87, where you give the summary of the complaints received, the line says all those being assessed as being invalid. Is it worth just clarifying that that was dealt with by the monitoring officer? I presume that's the case, because it makes it clear that it's not councillors determining, it's been dealt with in the proper process.
Yeah.
Everybody happy with that? Good. Anything else we need to deal with today?
That's it, Chair. You can close the meeting.
I therefore close the meeting and thank everybody for their attendance. Thank you. Have a pleasant.